Guten Tag, my name is Kevin McAleer, and I am the author of a new novel entitled POSTDOC, The Foreign and Other Misadventures of a Ne'er-do-well Scholar. It was published just 2 weeks ago here in Europe. It is forthcoming in North America in March of next year, 2022. And it is published by PalmArtPress, and I am now in the digs of PalmArtPress here in Berlin, where I also call home, Berlin that is, and where it just so happens our novel begins. The year is 1989. The wall's still up, hasn't fallen yet. And our protagonist, Steve McElhenney, a young doctoral candidate in history, is pursuing research in his chosen dissertation topic of German dueling in the 19th century. Now, Steve he has his base of operations, as it were, in West Berlin, but his research materials are primarily in East Berlin. So he's having to go across the border to East Berlin on a pretty much daily basis. And this is not unimportant for the subsequent narrative, because it is through this sustained exposure to communism that Steve is imbued with a great mistrust and even antipathy toward Marxism. Well, the wall falls, as does the Marxist government in East Germany. Steve finishes his research, goes back to America, defends his thesis, receives the PhD, and then he embarks on a quest for that holy grail of academic endeavor, a tenure-track professorship. And this is the basic drama of the novel. Will he or will he not succeed in obtaining that holy grail? And the basic drama is all the more dramatic because Steve is not what you would call a knight in shining armor. He is, in fact, just the opposite. He is a habitual drunkard, terrible teacher by his own admission. He doesn't give a damn about his lectures or his students. He's a chronic malcontent. He's a born contrarian. The list goes on and on. You get the idea. But his greatest handicap is that he is a young white male who is trying to forge a career in the affirmative action environment and politically correct atmosphere of American academe in the 1990s. Well, in clashing with the academic establishment, Steve drifts from one job to another, one woman to the other, one bottle to the next, and his drifting and clashing takes him beyond US borders to Madrid, Paris, Israel, Egypt, a few other places, until he finally wends his way back to Berlin, which in the meantime has become the new capital of a reunited Germany, and where Steve has obtained yet another fellowship, another postdoc. He's been stringing these things together over the years to try and keep his career chances alive, keep his hand in the game. And where we meet Steve now. My address for the next year was an academic institute housed in a turn-of-the-century villa in Berlin's extreme west, one of the city's tonier neighborhoods, and at edge of a forest where most of the duels had occurred and where wild boar still roamed. My boss, the man who ran this place, was finishing up his habilitation, which was basically a second PhD dissertation. You couldn't become a full professor of history in Germany without one. It involved years of intensive research and was monitored and reviewed and then defended before a committee, just as with the dissertation. I couldn't imagine doing two of these things in one lifetime, let alone back to back. It was cruel and unusual punishment with origins in the 17th century and had only survived into modern times since those presently holding professorships didn't want scholars coming up through the ranks to suffer any less than they had. The habilitation of my boss was some monumental study on the marriage and residence patterns of peripatetic sawmill workers in 19th century Switzerland, Germany, and Austria-Hungary, and he was pushing 50 years of age, so had to get this thing done and out, or else miss the boat for that much-cherished professor job. He was a smoker. You rarely saw him without a cigarette, and when the guy wasn't puffing away, he was taut as a wire, and his head had a palsy-like tremble. He seemed to be cracking under the strain. Other than that, his theoretical paradigm was Max Weber's 1,000-page Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft, a strain that would have me cracking all by itself. The place's name was the Institute for Modern Comparative History, and I had qualified for the fellowship based on my ethnological chapter contrasting the French and German duels. The Institute purported to do comparative history on topics which I found brain-numbing: public health in North America and Europe, agrarian policy in Turkey and Russia, infant mortality in Reykjavik and Singapore. But the one thing which was a subject of fascination to not just German historians, but people the world over, was strangely off limits to any comparison: the Third Reich and the Holocaust. I tried addressing the issue with the other postdocs, all of them German, but you couldn't mention Stalin or Pol Pot or Mao in the same breath with Hitler, since fascist violence trumped communist violence every time. The commies got a pass not only because Marxism was a so-called scientific theory that served as an all-encompassing explanatory model for the world's social ills, but the Marxists were also high-minded and striving for world peace and even utopia. And if millions of Ukrainians bit the dust, literally sometimes eating dirt during the Great Famine, it was regrettable, an unfortunate perversion of true communism, but the poor luckless bastards were just on the wrong side of history. All these postdocs were German, but they were West Germans, meaning no East Germans, who had lived under Russian occupation and communist rule, and I wondered how they might have felt about things. But these Wessis were careerists all and wished no suspicion cast that they were allowing the Nazis and their crimes to be relativized, their buzzword for whitewashed. So you had the absurd situation of comparative historians at the Institute for Modern Comparative History being unwilling to compare pivotal events of the modern era. I wasn't sure what was more impressive, the moral cowardice or intellectual dishonesty. One time I had it out with another postdoc. He laid the Holocaust as unparalleled crime against humanity trip on me and added that an American could have no idea how ashamed he was to be German. Well, I cited our enslavement of blacks, our decimation of the Indians, but he didn't want to hear it. Then I tried him on Vietnam, how we napalmed it to kingdom come, and I declared that if push came to shove, I think I'd rather be gassed than burnt to a crisp. "You're excusing Auschwitz," he said. By comparing it to Vietnam, Vietnam wasn't systematic genocide! And that seemed to settle it. Germans couldn't help throwing the word systematic into the equation, which evidently made it a far greater evil than just random or even targeted but less than efficient murder. And who was more systematic than the Germans? My favorite quote on this was from the Austrian writer Robert Musil, who said that Germans don't know whether they want heaven or hell, but only know they want to organize it. I was aching to cite that one in our discussions, but it would have only dumped napalm on their self-immolating fire. There seemed a freakish pride at work in the Germans, like they enjoyed being the world's arch-villains. So at a certain point, I just stopped caring and let them have their little pleasure. I was having few pleasures myself, especially of a carnal nature. The female postdocs at the Institute were uniformly asexual, neither physically appetizing nor fun, just mannish intellectuals who seemed determined that you be equally glum in their presence and hated your guts if you hadn't memorized Adorno's Minima Moralia in the original German. The closest I'd gotten to meeting potentially genial women had been for about 8 seconds in an exchange I had with another guy at the Institute, a German guy, and of course in German. "Some friends of mine get together once a week for an evening of polka," he said. "You might like to join us." I had danced polka a couple times in my life, at beer gardens, an easy dance, step hop, step hop. "I don't have a partner," I said. "You got any extra girls?" He looked at me strangely. "We don't want girls. It's better all guys." "Really? Girls ruin the atmosphere." "And what atmosphere is that?" "Guys with guys," he said plainly. "Girls are just a distraction." I'd never judged this dude a Schwuchtel, but hey, Berlin wasn't exactly Bible Belt territory. "And where do you have these polka evenings?" I asked. "We rotate," he said. "This week it's at my place." "You must have a big place." "How big a place you need to play polka?" That's when I heard it. Poker. The verb play tipped me off. He'd been talking poker the whole time. But the way Germans pronounce the word, it comes out polka. So that next night we played, and it wasn't strip poker, a thought which had also crossed my mind.